Welcome to a decade that redefined movies as we know them. An era where concepts were high and the budgets were higher. A time when technology allowed for the full reinvention of genres. A period when action heroes evolved, blockbusters nearly collapsed, and a revolution began in the shadows of Hollywood. This was the 90s. This was the end of the century. Since we last caught up with Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger, we found the two action heroes on the rise. Stallone had reached the top of his career in just 9 years after First Blood Part 2 and Rocky IV turned him into the #1 star on the planet. Schwarzenegger, who was still lagging behind his direct competitor, was showing a versatility and rising popularity that still kept him on the race. But the battle between these two rivals was about to take a new dimension as the summer of 1988 brought on an unexpected entrant in the action arena. The movie was based on Roderick Thorpe's Nothing Lasts Forever, a direct sequel to The Detective, which 20th Century Fox had adapted in 1968 with Frank Sinatra in the lead. The 70-year-old crooner passed on the opportunity to reprise his role as NYPD detective Joe Leland. Pitched as Rambo in an office building, ironic considering Die Hard on a ... would become a future industry staple to describe high-concept action vehicles, the title had a troubled production. The movie was particularly difficult to cast. The obvious names, such as Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and even action stars from the past, such as Clint Eastwood, James Caan, and Burt Reynolds, all passed on the role. Other suggested names included Nick Nolte, Richard Gere, Harrison Ford, and Mel Gibson, who, though associated with action titles, were hardly seen as pure action leads at the time. When finally Al Pacino and Paul Newman both passed on the role, producers turned to television actors who were in fact associated with the genre. But when MacGyver's Richard Dean Anderson and Miami Vice's Don Johnson declined, the powers in place knew they had to dig deeper. As an actor, Bruce Willis was known for his performance in ABC's hit dramedy Moonlighting. His theatrical track record, which consisted of two Blake Edwards collaborations, was mixed. Both The Comedy Blind Date and the westernish Sunset were critically derided, and the latter was deemed a box office bomb. When it was announced that Willis had been cast cleaning a cool $5 million for his role, eyebrows across Hollywood were raised. 20th Century Fox, the studio behind Die Hard, had little hope for the movie, with pundits predicting that the upcoming summer movie season would be dominated by the comedy Coming to America, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and two sequels, Crocodile Dundee 2 and the Stallone starring Rambo 3. The movie ended up becoming 1988's summer sleep hit and a major box office success. The reasons for its triumphant performance at the box office were multiple. For starters, it offered viewers something genuinely new and timely. Whilst most action films of the era featured exotic locations or fantastical scenarios, Die Hard presented a thoroughly modern setting that reflected contemporary anxieties about globalization. The plot centered on the Japanese-owned corporation's American headquarters being seized by European terrorists, offered a scenario that played on economic tensions and changing global power dynamics in the late 1980s. This contemporary approach extended beyond just the setting. Unlike the cartoonish villains in many action films of the time, Hans Gruber and his team were sophisticated, well-dressed professionals with a clear plan, more reflective of modern criminal enterprises than the stereotypical bad guys audiences were used to seeing. The action was far more realistic than the extravagant set pieces you'd find elsewhere at the time. Instead of endless ammunition and improbable stunts, audiences were treated to a hero who bled, struggled, and felt pain. Perhaps the most important reason was the nature of McClane's character. As an NYPD officer, McClane was closer to Harry Callahan and Paul Kersey than he was to Rambo. The character was an everyman, vulnerable and reactive, unlike the buffed, unstoppable forces of nature featured in your typical 80s action flick. Willis brought a sardonic wit and relatable humanity to John McClane, creating an action hero who relied more on his wits and determination than raw physical strength. His wisecracks under pressure, vulnerability, both physical and emotion, and the famous undershirt that gradually became more bloody than tattered as the film progressed, all helped establish a new template for action protagonists. Die Hard made studio executives all over Hollywood smile as it provided them with a solution to a growing problem: the ballooning budget of action movies. Stallone's Rambo 3, released that same summer, had cost roughly $60 million to produce, making it the most expensive movie ever made at the time. With its lean production values and focus on a single location, Die Hard offered the blueprint for creating thrilling action at a fraction of the cost. Both the effects of Die Hard's success weren't immediate. In fact, as the new decade dawned, both Stallone and Schwarzenegger were about to embark on a collision course that would redefine their rivalry and the very foundation of action cinema itself. The impact Die Hard has had since the movie's release has been both on point and overstated. Yes, the movie did prove that anyone who didn't fit the mold of either Sly or Arnie could be an action hero. It demonstrated that there was a market for action titles with slightly more complex narratives and themes that moved beyond simple good versus evil storylines. But the fact is that some of the apparent novelty and changes brought on by the 1988 action title had already started to take shape years before. Hollywood had been experimenting with casting everyman-like actors in action vehicles since the early 1980s. Think of Kurt Russell in Escape from New York, Roy Scheider in Blue Thunder, Tom Selleck in High Road to China, and the iconic Harrison Ford with the Indiana Jones series. There's even a more obvious example: Mel Gibson in 1987's Lethal Weapon. This action title not only continued this casting trend, but also introduced moviegoers to another name that changed the genre: Shane Black. Banning scripts that showcased sharp, sarcastic, and often hilarious dialogue, Black revamped the buddy cop dynamic in action films by emphasizing character relationships. He introduced more complex characters, far removed from the typical invincible hero archetype, playing a critical part in driving the action movie genre forward. His influence extended beyond just Lethal Weapon, creating a template for action films that balanced humor, character development, and thrilling set pieces. Finally, we find in Arnold Schwarzenegger himself another catalyst for change. Since he started his career as a lead action star, Schwarzenegger starred mostly in vehicles that were at the intersection of multiple genres, from fantasy pseudo-historical epics to sci-fi and horror hybrids, and even dystopian titles. The Austrian Oaks filmography, at least during its first decade, rarely featured the one-man army trope Stallone was known for, with Raw Deal and Commando being the sole examples of such execution. Further evidence supporting the fact that Die Hard wasn't an immediate game changer sits with none other than its sequel, released 2 years later, Die Hard 2: Die Harder. In just 2 movies, the action sequences were amped up to an over-the-top level that was simply implausible. McClane himself seemed less relatable in the sequel, ditching the vulnerability and struggle against overwhelming odds to become a larger-than-life action hero that aligned with the stereotype the 1988 original tried to subvert. Die Hard 2 did very little to put executives at ease, as it tapped into a growing concern within Hollywood: spiraling budgets. Published in 1991, the infamous Katzenberg Memorandum, penned by Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was then the head of Disney's motion picture division, criticized, amongst other aspects, the untamed mega budgets of Hollywood's productions and the industry's over-reliance on stars. Though he singled out some action titles such as Air America, Dick Tracy, and Another 48 Hours, Katzenberg's words would easily translate into a critique of the then current state of action movies. The fact is that during a period of 10 years spanning between 1982 and 1992, the production cost of action movies grew on average 20% per year, whereas the average cost of a Hollywood production grew roughly 17% during that same period. Escalating star salaries, the usage of bigger and more complex action sequences, and the increased integration of sophisticated special effects drove the costs skyward. Action movies were at the front and center of the blockbuster mentality that blossomed during the 1980s, with each of them being treated as an event movie. Budget records, which usually remained intact for decades, were now being broken in a matter of years. Rambo 3, Die Hard 2, and Terminator 2 Judgment Day, starring Stallone, Willis, and Schwarzenegger respectively, all held the title of the most expensive movies ever produced in the respective years they were released. All of this shows that the immediate impact of Die Hard, be that in narrative, scope, and lead choice, wasn't immediately felt across the industry. The movie did, as I already mentioned, cater to other needs. The then nascent straight-to-video market and independent studios such as Canon Films, which became relevant in the mid-1980s, helped produce the output necessary to satisfy viewers' increasing demand for action. This output increase resulted in a new brand of more affordable action heroes such as Michael Dudikoff, Dolph Lundgren, Carl Weathers, and the martial arts inclined Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal, which in turn became household names. Willis' success with Die Hard, along with Michael Keaton's successful outing in 1989's Batman, also paved the way for a potential solution to mitigate the inflated star salaries. I mean, why would a studio pay $12 million to have Stallone when they could get someone else for less than half the cost and reap higher profits? Still, as it stood, the two muscled A-listers were still engaged in their rivalry. And as the 1990s started, a new outcome was becoming clear. The battle between Stallone and Schwarzenegger was about to enter its most intense phase yet, one that would reshape not just their careers, but the entire landscape of action cinema. As the 1980s were drawing to a close, Stallone's once promising career and status as a bankable actor were now in question. The Italian stallion, who had dominated the action genre for nearly a decade, was beginning to show cracks in his commercial armor. Following the over-the-top financial debacle that severed Sly's relationship with Canon, the actor decided to revisit one of his two most iconic characters, John Rambo. Rambo 3 was an action-heavy piece set around the globe. A particularly troubled production and Stallone's $16 million paycheck, which accounted for roughly a quarter of the film's budget, turned the sequel into the most expensive movie ever made up until that time. The title's anti-Soviet motif, one that had propelled the series and its star into pop culture's lexicon, seemed dated and ineffective during the glasnost and perestroika era. The Cold War was thawing, but Rambo was still fighting yesterday's battles. Deemed one of the most violent movies ever made, Rambo 3 failed to turn a profit domestically and signaled a major downturn for the star. It was now evident that the formula that had worked in the past was no longer a viable option for Stallone, as 1990's Rocky V saw his iconic character underperforming with critics and audiences. Not even the movie's darker tone and proximity to the narrative of the 1976 original could salvage what became the lowest earner of the franchise. The effects of both Rambo 3 and Rocky V's reception were compounded by yet another flop, Lock Up, and a decent but forgettable buddy cop entry, Tango and Cash, both released in 1989. Stallone knew that he had to reinvent himself and tried his hand at comedy once again, with two back-to-back misfires. The underrated Oscar, released in 1991, and the laughless Stop or My Mom Will Shoot, released a year later. In what would become industry lore, Schwarzenegger admitted that he deliberately faked an interest in Stop or My Mom Will Shoot so that his rival would star in what was a surefire underperformer, thus sabotaging Stallone's career. Whilst the veracity of this claim is debatable, it showcases the personal edge their professional rivalry had taken. Schwarzenegger, on the other hand, was on top of the world and proved that the old show tune was right. Anything you can do, I can do better. Whereas Stallone insisted on cultivating his over-the-top image, Schwarzenegger branched out to hybrid genre movies, paving a new way forward for action stars. Comedy, a genre where Sly proved time and time again he was ill-suited for, was something Arnold excelled in, with Kindergarten Cop and Twins both becoming top 10 box office hits in 1990 and 1988, respectively. The former muscle man displayed a surprising comedic timing and self-awareness that allowed him to broaden his appeal beyond the action audience. Even though Stallone had directed several titles, his ability behind the camera was never particularly praised. Schwarzenegger, on the other hand, was hailed for helming the 1990 Tales from the Crypt episode The Switch with his direction, proving that the action star also showed a nice flair for the macabre. This diversification of talents further enhanced Schwarzenegger's reputation as a multidimensional entertainer, whilst Stallone struggled to break free from his action hero typecasting. Arnold matched Stallone's feats at the box office. In 1990, courtesy of Kindergarten Cop and one of the most expensive movies ever made, Total Recall, he became the #1 box office draw in the world, a title held by Stallone in 1977 and 1985. Total Recall demonstrated Schwarzenegger's ability to star in thought-provoking sci-fi while still delivering the action goods. Paul Verhoeven's film was violent, satirical, and intellectually stimulating, a far cry from the straightforward action vehicles that had defined the genre in previous years. A year later, he starred in yet another high-budgeted extravaganza that revolutionized filmmaking forever, Terminator 2: Judgment Day, the highest earner of the year. Though its $205 million intake, twice the movie's budget, was several millions behind Stallone's Rocky, 1976 highest earner when adjusted to inflation. With groundbreaking special effects, a strong environmental message, and surprising emotional depth, T2 confirmed that Schwarzenegger wasn't just a star, he was a cultural phenomenon. The war seemed to be over, and Schwarzenegger looked like the obvious winner. Audiences and producers alike were eager for his next hit. His unique accent had become an asset rather than a liability. His catchphrases entered the cultural lexicon, and his movies consistently delivered at the box office. Meanwhile, Stallone was struggling to find his footing in a landscape that seemed to have moved on without him. The Italian stallion appeared to be on the ropes, with no clear path back to prominence. But, as the saying goes, necessity is the mother of invention. But someone forgot to tell Hollywood that reinvention can be a cruel stepmother, as 1993 was about to brutally demonstrate.